Welcome to The Next Word. I'm your host, Christine Warnke, and it's a great honor to introduce and welcome Eleanor Fierst, the esteemed great-granddaughter of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and President Franklin Roosevelt. With a deep connection to our nation's history and a heartfelt passion for understanding the roles First Ladies have played, Anna will provide her insights into the profound impact they have had on our society. Through her perspective, she will share how these remarkable women have shaped not only the White House, but also the social fabric of our nation. And Anna, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Christine,
Once
for having me. It's wonderful to be here and to be able to discuss with your audience the importance of what Eleanor Roosevelt stood for, how she used the East Wing, and just basically her role as a pioneering First Lady in so many ways.
Absolutely. So. And the impact she had on other First Ladies that came after her. And
right.
Certainly, we had some that came before her, and they had an impact as well, which we'll talk about.
Right, right, exactly. So if, do you want to, we can jump into that? Do you want to talk about?
Let's talk about a little bit, you talk a little about President Hoover's wife.
So President Hoover's wife was really underestimated. She did not promote her own activities in the White House, but she was a brilliant woman, really, and was also one of the first female graduates of Stanford. And towards the end of Hoover's administration, this would have been 30-31, the problems of the Depression were growing and growing, and people started writing to her. She realized she could play a role in responding to the social ills that had been created, of course, by the Depression and the onset of that. So she started using the East Wing at that point, moving in stenographers, typists, the whole pool of secretaries and people who could help her respond to the needs of the American people. They started writing her. When Eleanor Roosevelt came in, she actually asked people to write to her. Well, of course, by that time, the Depression had deepened to to one of its lowest levels. And people wrote to her by the hundreds. Maybe she got hundreds of letters every day.
Really?
And in order to respond to that, she started setting up and did set up a whole pool of, again, maybe modeled on Lou Hoover's example, but expanded it at that point, of course. And she had a very dedicated crew of people, typists, secretaries. They all worked out of the East Wing. So this rapidly became a hub of her kind of small army of mostly young women who helped her cope with the onslaught of angst and just terrible social problems and mostly women would write to her, of course, and she would try to respond. But this took hours every day, and this became really a center of administrative support for the administration.
Absolutely, and she really, going back to the 1920s when she was having, children and married, of course. At that point, she was not obviously the First Lady. She was not involved in many women's issues per se, or the suffrage movement. Or can we talk a little bit about that?
So the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, as many of us know. Prior to that, no, she was not that involved, and she knew about, of course, suffrage activities. It was Franklin, interestingly, who said, Babs, as he used to call her, you really need to get involved in this. But she did have 6 children within 10 years and was very occupied in trying to keep the household running. And it wasn't until after suffrage passed that she began to see the power of the vote and really understand how she could help other women understand that. And so she became and by that time he had developed polio. So in the early 20s, she became more and more active in terms of getting out there and bringing back information to him. But in the process, getting to know so many of the women who are mentioned in this planner that we put together, and we'll talk about that later. But that was the beginning of her political activity and her kind of going back to school, learning how to be, in effect, a politician.
Well, and with the polio, with he getting polio, she had to really play more of a public role.
Yeah.
Because he couldn't be out there.
Right. She became his legs, and his ears. because you think about it, there was obviously no computers, nothing, no
Right.
radio had barely started.
Right.
So she had to go out and talk to every single person individually. There was no air flight network, so she'd have to be taking trains all over the place. Long distance calls were expensive, so
That's
everything
right.
was done by written. So we have all this written memorabilia of all the places she visited. Not all of them, but many of them. And the diaries from people, because people kept diaries back then. And that you really can track how she developed as a person who was fascinated and worked passionately for social justice issues. That began in the 20s.
And beyond just social justice issues, she was concerned about our military. And speaking of long distance, she actually traveled to the Pacific.
Right. So, and this is it's a great story. So thank you. In 43, and we've mentioned this, and Veterans Day is coming up, of course, is right around the corner. She traveled to the South Pacific to the height of the war, especially the height of the war in the Pacific Theater, to talk to troops in their beds and comfort them, take letters home, write down, well, okay, so your mother lives so and so I'm going to reach out to her when I get home. And if she didn't, she had her staff say, the First Lady visited your son.
Fabulous.
He's fine. He wants to pass on this message. And talk to the generals, of course, there, and said, well, what are you doing about this problem or that problem? She really was an advocate in a very, very underappreciated way for the soldiers during World War II.
And the women in the military at that point, the nurses.
And basically got behind pushing for women to be allowed bigger roles in the WACs. They called them the WACs and the waves. And women had no role at all. Some role in World War I as ambulance drivers and so forth. But I think what she wanted to say, in World War II, the men are all gone. Women have to step in, and not just as Rosie the Riveter, which is a fabulous thing, but also in a military capacity to do whatever they could to fly, air supply, resupply planes. I mean, there were a lot of women. There was a whole Navy, well, it was called the Army Air Corps at that time. Air Force had not come into being. And these women acted, there was a substantial number of women who said, I want to fly, this is the only way I can fly. And of course, don't forget Tuskegee. That's another story.
That's
so
another story, right.
Was
she involved in this, in the Tuskegee Airmen?
Well, she encouraged them. I mean, she went down there, she flew with them, she encouraged and basically gave it a huge PR boost. But the development of the airfields to allow black pilots to train was a struggle in itself.
Absolutely.
And so by her going there and flying with this pilot, she said, hey, this is the First Lady doing this. So it's
absolutely
it's using her position to elevate these issues. That's the important thing.
And with the Tuskegee Airmen, they were elevated, but they were incredible. Pilots.
Pilots, yeah.
And they never really had lost many men in those flights.
Right.
But they also had a social message. And to this day, they're so revered, really. And in fact, the originals have all passed away. Unfortunately. Almost all of them have passed away.
I think the last one did pass away last year.
Yes. So they've been, well, that's fascinating. So beyond all that, though, going now to the Center for the Roosevelt Center, and you're the chair of the board.
Yeah, that's the Eleanor Roosevelt Center at Valkill, and we're up in Hyde Park, New York.
Right.
So I'm up there all the time. We have events. We do things. It's a legacy organization, but it's based on promoting her legacy as a social justice pioneer, and so we're out there.
But you have another big project, which is the National Women's Foundation Planner.
Right. And
talk a little bit about how you put that together, because
well, that's something I have to big tip of the hat to Pamela Johnson, Dr. Johnson, who has a background in photo editing, which was enormously helpful, because this planner has a photo for every week, and these were photos which were hard to find in some cases, a quote for every week, and also a journal space. So it's not just a weekly desk planner, it's a place to sort of put what, like I say, if you have a meeting that you for that week, you use it for that meeting, but you also use it for inspiration, for ideas that you might have.
Right.
Maybe you can use that quote in a talk that you're about to give. But no, it's a very useful, you can throw this in your briefcase, and we're very excited about it because it really does show, it's not just about ER, it's about all the women she worked with, and sometimes men, especially in the civil rights field. So, it covers the waterfront of her life, essentially.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
So now we're talking about the East Wing and just the structure and how it was built, and then the renovations it went through. And can you talk a little bit about that period? And
So the fascinating story about the East Wing, it began in the TR administration, and
Teddy Roosevelt.
Sorry, it was actually Eleanor's uncle.
Right.
So she's had a long sort of story with this. It began as a way so that they could offload carriages more quickly. It would just take a while. So this is a ceremonial entrance, purely that, nothing to do with the First Lady needing her own office space. That was just not part of the First Lady's scene, of their role at that time. So then it developed, and as like I said earlier, Lou Hoover was really probably the first First Lady, to use it as an administrative center for her own issuance of her own orders, her own structure, how she wanted to get her message out. And Eleanor then took that over and just sort of blew it up. And then, of course, was there for 12 years. So she had a long time to make this happen. The other major, sort of getting back into the history of its reconstruction, it was reconstructed in 1942, and I believe that's when they added this bunker that you and I were talking about earlier.
Where Laura Bush
exactly
went to during 9/11.
Right. Which is really interesting. I mean, and I think at some point, there was a bowling alley in there. This is prior to the bunker phase. Richard Nixon liked to bowl, so there was that. But also after, with Jackie Kennedy, started going back in, using that space, that office space, because in 1942 they also expanded the office space, and which would have been something Eleanor was saying, no, you've got to make, you've got to have something better for our staff. So basically, I'd say starting back up with Jackie's term as First Lady. Lady Bird Johnson used it extensively. There have been articles, of course, about the demolition of the East Wing, and many former press secretaries and staff members have come back and said, yes, I used to work here, here's what I used to do, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, really?
So
fascinating.
it's the history of the work that went on there has, of course, now is the physical space is gone, and I just hope that that East Wing magazine, for example, is an online blog. If you're interested in this, you can reference that. But it's now I don't know what's going to happen. Who knows?
But the history is there, and the events that took place during the Roosevelt era were phenomenal, and
they're phenomenal.
Touch upon.
Yeah, and a lot of it was sort of people didn't really know where any of this work went on. But the West Wing had already been created. It was cramped. It's always been a very cramped space. So you had to move. If the First Lady had an agenda, and of course Eleanor did, Lou Hoover did, but she didn't have much time to develop it. And then successive First Ladies have had their own agendas. And one of my favorite quotes actually is from Betty Ford. And she said, if the West Wing is the mind of the nation, then the East Wing is the heart.
That's great.
And it's a wonderful quote.
It's a wonderful, and she was amazing First Lady.
Yeah, she was an incredible, very, very courageous woman.
So we're going to come back to that.
Okay.
We have to take a short break.
Okay.
And we'll be back to talk more about Betty Ford, too.
Okay, good.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
You're watching The Next Word. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be back.
Yeah, I know. Wait, look at that. It's so sad.
Welcome back to The Next Word. I'm your host, Christine Warnke, and joining me is Anna Eleanor Fierst, great-granddaughter of the Roosevelts. And speaking of your lineage, so your mother is the granddaughter.
Oldest grandchild.
Oldest grandchild.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. And she's still alive and appreciates the role very much of her, of course, of her grandmother, and has thought much about it. But she really grew up and spent the first few years of her life both in New York City and then in the White House for 2 or 3 years. And then,
she did?
Yes,
Okay.
and she and her brother. And then they moved out to Seattle. And my grandmother had remarried at that point, married a journalist, and they took over the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, which was around until a couple of years ago. Now it's folded as a daily newspaper. But so she grew up more in Seattle than she did in this town and Washington. But she has fond memories of the White House, although she says it is a goldfish bowl. And you were, told to. There are funny letters that would come into my great-grandmother about, I'm told that Sisty and Buzzy always eat all their vegetables. Can you tell me how you make them do it? So things like that.
Things like that.
My grandmother said, no, we would do what everybody did. We'd try to hide it under the carpet or something like that. Right. And so she has some interesting and fun stories like that. And also knew her grandmother, of course, as an adult, which is quite a privilege.
Which is a wonderful privilege.
Yeah.
And interesting thing is, in terms of the relationship that the First Lady had with the Secret Service.
Right. And there's a terrific, and that's a great question, because this is one of the most enjoyable sort of excursions into the reality of Eleanor as the First Lady, was to learn how she would try to escape the Secret Service at any particular time or opportunity she had. So finally, given this tendency, they said, well, you're going to have her as her bodyguard that she didn't mind having around too much. He was a nice guy, and they got along, and he finally said, well, this is a man named Earl Miller, you're going to have to learn to shoot. You're going to have to carry a pistol in the glove compartment of your car, and you're going to have to, if you're going to go off the reservation occasionally. And so she did. There's a great picture in the planner of her at target practice. And she said, if the necessity arose, I do know how to use a pistol. And that's she quoted that in her My Day columns, which this planner is based largely on her daily column that went out on a syndicated basis to hundreds of newspapers. So people would read this every day to say, what did the First Lady do today?
Oh, that's great.
So,
I love it. So she learned how to shoot, which people don't know about.
We don't know how well she learned to shoot, but
we don't know how well she could shoot.
Possibly it was not terribly.
That's a great little piece of that's great.
Yeah, but you don't want to mess around.
But she did so much in terms of just, again, getting back to your point, reaching out to the public. Can we talk a little bit about, her activities and how she did communicate? Because, of course, we didn't have internet. We didn't have...
Yeah. So she gave, of course, a lot of radio addresses, as his famously her husband did, with fireside chats. But any opportunity she had to speak to a group, she would take it if her time allowed. She would often, in her My Day columns, reflected that, and those are all online, by the way. But she would chronicle usually 4 or 5 different stops she made. And oftentimes, so she'd go to a specific place, region of the country, and she'd hop on the trains most of the time.
On the trains.
Between cities, giving speeches, in various places, meeting with groups, women's groups, whatever they were, social, civic. Oftentimes, democratic organizations. There'd be a Democratic club here, there'd be one over here. And since her husband was often, sometimes 2 years before an election, he'd start thinking about, well, where should I send Eleanor? And not that was always at his command, but she would find ways in which to be useful in a political sense, but oftentimes, too, in a very social sense. In social justice, she'd meet with groups that she'd get criticized for savagely later. Sometimes there would be a youth group that had communist leanings, and she'd go talk to them and say, "Well, what do you think about this? Why are you where are you going with this?" She was very good about talking college campuses. So there's the kinds of there was no group that she would not go and talk to if they were sincerely interested in discussing ideas.
If they were
Yeah. So I mean,
fascinating.
yeah.
And she had a whole decade to.
Well, she had, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
once the war, I mean, I have to say that once the war started, we entered the war. She had to be more careful, I think, and that's why she pivoted at that point to addressing the needs of the country during this wartime.
Right.
Talking to women's groups about how to get involved and what to do and how to be useful, and how to become citizens in a different capacity,
Right.
not just as, and I won't say just homemakers, but to get beyond those traditional roles.
Absolutely, right. Especially now that we talked about the fact that we have Veterans Day coming up, and she did have an impact
Yeah,
on
no.
the veterans of our country.
And she was also, just want to point out, and we mentioned this in the My Day Planner, that she was very upset and very much against the internment camps, the Japanese American internment camps, and visited a couple of them at least, and spoke out about it as much as she could.
Oh, she was. That's so interesting.
And she was so adamant about and opposed to the sort of the whole, the beginnings of this. She knew it was going to probably happen in some capacity, but it was how to get the War Department, as it was called then, to retract from this, to sort of take a softer approach to this issue, because everybody was, especially the West Coast, people were roiled up about this. And she was saying, let's think about this. Let's figure out what are we doing here. And finally, the president said, "You have to back off. This
Oh, really?
Go,
He said,
essentially, just no, hands off this issue. We can't."
that's just
So it was
surprising.
It
Wow.
became a real point of contention between the two of them. But once he had made that decision, she said, "Okay, this is a military decision. I can't do anything more." So once it became a thing, and Japanese Americans were interned, she made a point of going around to talk to them, find out what they needed, what the conditions were in these camps. And of course, many times they were terrible conditions, and try to do something about it. But at that point, it was
interesting.
The horse had left the barn.
I was not aware of that. Wow, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of another first lady that really kind of took her message to Congress and to the public and was Betty Ford. And she actually convinced the President Ford that she should be allowed to reach out
Right. I mean,
for her issues, and she was very vocal.
She was very vocal, and she was, interesting thing, I think, trying to think, she really was the first lady who was out there about issues, breast cancer, for example, and addiction issues.
Yes.
So these were things that were very personal to her. And
Yes.
I've always said, my mother's always had a huge admiration for Betty Ford.
Yes, I have.
And so I've sort of grown up in this mode where I've thought this is a person who had really serious personal issues, health issues, and she was open about them, which allows other people to say, okay, I can discuss this with my family. I can be honest with, and it was an opening up, I think, that Betty Ford. And so we talk about soft power, the soft power of the East Wing, and the First Lady. That's a great example in modern times of this kind of soft power.
Absolutely. And look at Laura Bush. I mean, she was very involved in educating Afghan women. And,
literacy.
Literacy was huge. It was
a big deal. And she was
a big deal. And she was
and
impactful.
she was a librarian, and she sort of put her mouth where her interests were, in a way that was very, very beneficial. So, I mean, I think that the role of the modern First Lady, I mean, they followed in Eleanor's footsteps, certainly, but she cast her own mold, and of course the country was in crisis. This is the other thing. I mean, serious, 2 back-to-back crises, that Eleanor stepped into that role. You were talking about Laura Bush being shuttled down to the bunker in the East Wing during 9/11. So, I mean, that was again another crisis. And then she stepped in, Mrs. Bush did, in the issue about Afghan women and literacy. So, there again, it was the First Lady creating space for an issue of social justice, and stepping into that and embracing it. Right. I mean, it's incredibly important.
Oh, definitely. So going back to the planner, you talk about the months, right? Like so.
Right. Each
so
month
let's
has
talk
a
about
theme.
a little bit about each month has a theme.
Right, and so we begin with a bit about her beginnings, and this is my favorite, and I know you're going to show this a little bit, but this is the White House press corps, and each month not only has a theme about their civil rights. There's a chapter on that. There's Allies in Action. These are the women who she worked with, who she changed, and they changed her. So, there was this openness to ideas, which is an incredible part of her.
Yep.
I think really is one of the Eleanor Roosevelt, the New Deal. There's a section here on Valkill, where her home in Hyde Park, New York. So in building the future, the power of youth and education. So every month has a montage, has quotes, has photos. It's a very fun planner because if you're have any interest in 20th century history, this is kind of the mid-century part. This is a real big part of it. And she had a role in this in a way that people don't appreciate.
Oh, no, it's amazing.
So
No,
it's a
absolutely.
brilliant
Huge
way to
role.
organize the volume of information.
Oh, very much so. I mean,
Yeah.
And she, you're going back to the East Wing today, and because it's the whole issue of having to balance, modernizing yet preserving history.
Right.
We touch upon that a little bit about how you.
So there's been a lot of discussion about how to preserve, and why was it not preserved, the East Wing as such. And I think that part of it is, people, you have to go through a planning. If this had been done in a different way, the whole demolition, you would have gone through a whole planning process, and architectural plans would have been approved, which would have accommodated the current president's desires for more entertainment space, but would have also allowed for the preservation of this existing space in some fashion. So that's why you take it slow, because as everybody has said, this is the people's house. This is not any one person's house. This is a house. It belongs to all of us, and so there is this. And getting back to the tension I mentioned, there are things you don't need to preserve about a physical space.
Right.
And so, that's the part of. This is why historic preservationists get involved, and they say, "Wait a minute, this happened here. This is what we want to treasure." This was not so important. Maybe the file rooms. That can go, and we can create more space for what the current president would like. But there's this push-pull between what to save and what to do to accommodate the current president's wishes. So, or somebody who it doesn't have to be necessarily a president. It can be some other interest group. Right. But it is there's always this back and forth, and the problem is it takes time.
So Anna, this has been so enlightening, and I know the viewers are going to really enjoy watching this episode.
Well,
thank you for being here and sharing the planner and sharing all these stories, which none of us would know about.
Well, I appreciate
Except
your
your
giving me the
family,
time.
Thank you.
It's really been an honor to be on your program.
Thank you. So thank you to my guest, Anna Eleanor Fierst, for joining us. Tune in next week for another episode of The Next Word.